On September 20th, Nepal's President Ram Yadav announced that his country had adopted a new constitution. This is the 7th constitution to be adopted by Nepal in the last 67 years and the first by democratically elected representatives. The new constitution, which itself is the result of 8 years of deliberation, has met with widespread opposition not only against the constitution itself but also against India's perceived intervention. To discuss the issue, we're joined by Srinivasan Ramani, Associate Editor of The Hindu and an expert on Nepal. Thanks for joining us, Srini. Now, given that the process of consultation has taken 8 years, why are we seeing all these problems being raised now, both inside Nepal and, of course, comments from outside? Weren't the consultation processes sufficiently inclusive?
More than the process of consultation itself, we should understand that there is a certain kind of out in Nepal on the issue of state restructuring. If you remember, before this Constituent Assembly was elected, the first Constituent Assembly was elected in 2007, there were massive protests, what was called Jan Andolan. The protests were on two issues basically. The first issue was restoration of democracy and conversion of Nepal from a monarchy to a republic. And the second issue was for comprehensive state restructuring, a demand that came from people living in the plains who are called the Madhesis in particular, and also other people in the midwest of Nepal, the Janajatis, who are roughly the equivalent of tribals in India. Now, these two sets of people, in the plain dwellers and the hill dwellers, and the tribal hill dwellers, they demanded comprehensive state restructuring because they felt that Nepal for long has been controlled by a certain set of elites from the Brahmin and the Kshatriya classes. And they thought that unless Nepal has a federal reorganization which empowers people in the plains and in the mid-hills, and provinces are demarcated on the basis of some degree of ethnic determination, a true democratization would not be complete. So, when in the run-up to the CA, this demand was a very important demand, and this demand was incorporated in the interim constitution that was adopted by the main political parties when they went to the elections.
Right.
So, after elections, the first thing that the Constitutional Assembly did was declare Nepal a republic. It was also a very popular demand. After all, the Jan Andolan started off as a protest against monarchy, and at that time there was a consensus among all parties that Nepal has to be made into a republic, including external actors such as India. But on the issue of state restructuring, there was always a divide between those who are seeking the status quo, that is retaining Nepal as a province, as a group of provinces determined not on the basis of ethnic determination, but on basically a districting process, and others who wanted a more comprehensive state restructuring. Now, the other problem that was bedeviling this constitution writing process was the issue of the non-completion of the peace process with the Maoists. So it took almost 5 years for the peace process to complete. But there was no consensus on the state restructuring issue, and that actually resulted in the first CA being dissolved, and the second CA being elected. Now, what happened was there was a clear divide between the UML, that is the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist-Leninists, and the Nepali Congress on one side, and the Maoists and the Madhesi parties on the other side on this issue of state restructuring. So the latter wanted comprehensive restructuring. The former did not want any comprehensive restructuring. So up till May, June this year, when we had the earthquake in Nepal, this divide persisted and there was no consensus. What happened after the earthquake was that there was a sudden belief that too much time had passed without the constitution being written, and the parties had to come on board and get the constitution written, because governance was more important than constitution writing. That was the view among all parties.
Right.
So what happened was the Maoist leadership actually moved on to accept the UML Congress viewpoint on the restructuring process. So there were minor concessions made here and there. They decided on a 7-state model, which did not really consider what the Madhesis in particular wanted. So while almost 2/3 of the Nepali Constituent Assembly, that is UML, the Maoists and the Nepali Congress, agreed on finishing up the constitution writing process, the Madhesis were still an aggrieved party. because their concerns were not taken on board.
When you say that these issues of state reorganization have not been fully addressed, in what way do you mean specifically that they've not been fully addressed?
Currently, there is just one province which has a Madhesi majority, which has a Madhesi majority.
Right.
Initially, the Madhesis wanted a single Terai province, in which all the Madhesis are in the majority. But in the western areas and in the eastern areas, there were other groups who were not necessarily Madhesis, who also wanted provinces of their own.
Right.
So what happened was there were various models that were discussed, and in the end of the first CA, the one most robust model that came about was asked for a two-state solution within the Madhesh, and also state for the Tharus in the west and the Morums and other people in the east.
So essentially, all the ethnic identities would get their own state. That was basically the model.
No, not necessarily, but a certain degree of leeway to ethnic determination was given in the bill that was more or less discussed in the back end of the first CA.
Right.
Now, Nepali Congress and the UML refused to let that model pass through. Right. So instead, what has currently happened is that they have come up with a six-state model where in each of these provinces, the Bahuns and the Chetris, the dominant classes, are still the Pahadia people, the hill people are still in some degree of majority. Okay, so it is a certain degree of gerrymandering that has happened. Right? That is issue number one. The second issue is electoral constituencies. Determination of electoral constituencies have also been done in such a way that the Madhesis are not in majority in these provinces.
Right.
Now the thing is that the plains dwelling people are almost 50% of the population, and they believe that they have never been part of the decision making or the governing structure, and this has been a long-standing demand for almost 5-6 decades. So they believe that if certain degree of federal determination is made in which they feel that they own the process of state restructuring, that would be a positive step, which has not happened.
So what, other than this issue of state reorganization, are the most important points in this new constitution? Is it actually, for instance, a progressive constitution? I understand, so for instance, while the constitution talks about things like a right to a clean environment, it talks about rights to the LGBT community, ensures there's proportional inclusion of women in state agencies, gives equal property rights to women, all things that the Indian constitution, for instance, does not do. It also does contain many retrograde steps. So, for instance, it bars children, Nepali women and foreign men from being considered, for high office. It also prescribes cow slaughter and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, what to you are the most important points of this constitution?
See, this constitution is clearly an advance over the 1990 constitution. The 1990 constitution came up after a previous Jan Andolan. That Jan Andolan was against absolute monarchy, and at the time, a constitutional monarchy was adopted as a model for Nepal.
Right.
This constitution, on the other hand, clearly moves power to the people. It's a republican constitution, number one. That's a massive advance, significant advance. Number two, it's a secular constitution. There were doubts whether or not the word secularism will be used in the preamble of the constitution. It was retained in the final instance. There was a lot of pressure from various political parties, and the status quo did not want it, but finally they were prevailed upon, and secularism was retained. As you said, various provisions of affirmative action were added into the constitution. So overall, this is clearly a significant advance from the previous constitution. There is no doubt about it, and it's a very progressive constitution. And the fact that nearly 500 people, or 500 out of the 600, more than 500, 520 odd legislators voted in favor of the constitution, makes it an inclusive constitution. There's no doubt about it. That said, the issues of the Madhesis, the concerns of the Madhesis, which also includes the one that you pointed out, that Nepali women were married to foreigners, the children born to them are not given or could not inherit Nepali citizenship. This is actually something that addresses the Madhesis concerns the most. That does not address the Madhesis concerns the most, because many Madhesis have, Madhesi women are married to Indian men, right?
Right.
So there's an open border, and there are cultural similarities. So this is something that affects the Madheshi people the most. This provision, for example. So the Madheshis clearly have a grievance and a valid one, that they are left out from this process. While it is an inclusive constitution and many progressive measures have been taken on board, the fact that the status quo is still have managed to get their get their veto in.
So, does the constitution have any specific steps to ensure the protection of minority rights? Is there anything there that could actually be used to satisfy the Madhesis and the other minority groups in Nepal?
You see, while if you talk on religious minorities, right?
Yeah.
There are enough protections in this constitution. That's not a problem. But Madhesis here are not religious minorities.
Right.
They are ethnic minorities.
Right.
And technically speaking, it's difficult to say whether they are minorities at all. Right?
Okay.
The 50% of the population is estimated to be people living in the plains.
Right.
So, and if you look at the divisions within the hill living people, there are various castes and sects and groups. And so, therefore, to call the Madhesis minorities is technically
probably not correct then.
Not correct.
Yeah.
So, the basic question is that whether or not there is enough leeway given to a certain degree of ethnic determination for federal restructuring.
Right.
Now, New Delhi has reportedly asked Nepal to make as many as 7 changes to the constitution. Are you aware of what these demands specifically are? And do you think that India's actions are actually an affront to the sovereignty of Nepal? Or can India, practically speaking, stay out of any such issue given that we are their closest neighbor and have such close relations with them? Or do you think India, in the final analysis, has overstepped the bounds of providing friendly neighborly advice?
This is a difficult question. Let me unpack these questions. Number one, is India's contention that the Nepali constitution is not inclusive enough, right or wrong?
Yeah.
I think India's contention is correct. Okay. Number two, whether is India doing the right thing by applying certain degree of pressure in terms of closing the border and trying to pull some levers in terms of because India is, Nepal being a landlocked country and being economically dependent on India, is India right in pushing the economic levers in order to push Nepal to do the needful in the form of amendments? Now, that's a difficult question to answer. Having said that, and I would say that technically India should not do this because this actually violates the sovereignty of Nepal, and it also is from a pragmatic viewpoint, it's not a right step to do because it invokes Nepali nationalism.
Right.
Now, the issue is that is to be understood is that Nepal has slowly progressed towards a modern democracy. It has taken years for it to do so. Initially, if you know, till the 1950s, Nepal was a feudal aristocracy ruled by the Ranas. Right? It took Indian intervention of some kind for Nepal to transition from a Ranacracy to a constitutional monarchy.
Right.
Okay? But India would have preferred a democracy in Nepal. But at the same time, the monarchy was very powerful, and democracy took. For it to become a democracy, Nepal took literally 40 years.
Yeah.
Each step of the way, when transition from Ranacracy to constitutional monarchy, from constitutional monarchy to absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, each step of the way, Indians played an important role. So the hand of India in this progressive transition cannot be denied. Right. Secondly, a stable Nepal is in India's security interest as well. The Madhesh is also a hotbed of criminal activity. There's an open border.
Yeah.
In the past, it has been used to stage for example, the leader of the Indian Mujahideen was Nepal. The Kandahar
hijacking.
That originated in Kathmandu.
Yeah.
And Nepal's geopolitical location, its proximity to its presence in the Himalayas, not very far away from Kashmir, it's bordering China. These are all the security establishment in India and the Ministry of External Affairs believes that this is a very important and a very important geopolitical location, and a stable Nepal is in best interest of India as well.
Right.
Now, a stable Nepal would automatically mean a stable Tarai. Protest in Tarai and unstable Tarai is not in India's interest.
Right.
It's a very criminal and unsavory elements can come into the Indian.
Across the border. Yes.
So technically speaking, India is within its rights to demand from the Nepali political class that it takes steps to ameliorate the interests of the plains dwelling people.
Right.
Now, the question is whether they are doing the right thing by going on this putting economic pressure on Nepal. Is that the right step to do? That I think is not the right step to do. There are other elements also. The current the NDA regime in India, while it agrees with the interests of the Madhesis, there is also an element in the BJP ruled government who believes that secular Nepal is not in their interest.
Right.
So certain degree of instability that's being created in this turmoil is also being driven by the fact that there are elements within the BJP who do not want secular Nepal, right? So, so the Indian government should be careful that these interests don't get play while
Sure.
they want. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Srinivas, for joining us, and we will bring you back to discuss more issues relating to Nepal. And thank you for joining us today.